The Decadent in love with his Psychopomp, Thomas Mann's Death in Venice, and Adrian Lyne's Lolita. The Decadent Artist and the Child-Muse. A quote by Nabokov. I loved her more tenderly than Tristan adored Isolde, more hotly than Petrarca desired his Laura, more romantically than Poe loved little Virginia. Unquote. In his knowledgeability, Humbert qualifies his triumphing love for Lolita as powerful enough to outstand a deathly ending legend of two young lovers, a lifetime enthrallment for a muse outlived 26 years by one of Italy's finest poets, and the love Edgar Allan Poe had for his 13-year-old cousin and bride who died aged 24, and whom he mourned with the poem Annabel Lee. Humbert draws the reader into a realm of adoration and marvelousness by artfully using comparative words. However, where there is love and beauty in Humbert's universe, there is hurt and repugnance. The words and names he chooses to designate his love are impressive and ostentatious, but they imply calamity, trauma, and death, which is very visible in one of the introductory shots of Humbert in Lyne's movie. What the spectator witnesses here is a body part of action, a hand, smeared with blood, which does not belong to Humbert, but to his shadowy doppelganger, Claire Quilty, whom he had just killed. As Poe writes in William Wilson, A Tale, quote, "You have conquered and I yield," unquote. Humbert unencumbers himself of the opaquer, less scrupulous and more frightening side of his, which is personified by Quilty, but only after he has already lost Lolita. After Lolita escapes from Humbert, she will be Quilty's runaway conquest, and Humbert yields, because he has no other choice. He lost the two parts that determine him, his blamelessness and his cruelty, incarnated by Lolita and Quilty. Poe goes on by saying that, quote, "Yet henceforward art thou also dead to the world and its hopes," unquote. With Quilty's death and the forfeiture of Lolita, Humbert has been robbed of his reason of existence. He is annihilated and senseless in the aftermath of his actions after Quilty, who, quote, "represents the tension in the movie," unquote, is gone. This screenshot elucidates Humbert's hand after the vengeful use of a gun, the only necessary and good-natured crime he committed in his eyes. He is driving without any sense of orientation, except for the remaining object of Lolita he is carrying between his fingertips, signifying the motive for the bloodbath he caused. On his fingers, Quilty's blood is drying. Quote, "The side of Humbert that has no redemption at all, the side of Humbert that is unforgivable, that is Quilty," unquote, as Jeremy Irons phrased it. Poe concludes that, quote, in me didst thou exist, and in my death see by this image, which is thine, how utterly thou hast murdered thyself," unquote. Quilty existed in Humbert and vice versa. However, Humbert amputated this existence from himself by murdering Quilty, the, quote, "Humbert without a conscience, without any sense of soul," unquote, as Frank Langella described him. The calamitous passion they both share assimilates and concurrently differentiates them, as in Humbert's hands glues guilty blood and the relics of a memory, an object that once belonged to his love, Lolita's hairpin. In contrast to Humbert, Aschenbach has no physical relationship with his body of desire, and his admiration remains in the realm of the Platonic. Overwhelmed by the appearance of a young boy, Tarjou, the poet can hardly find words to express his captivation that only dares to become erotic in his reveries. Unlike Lolita, who traverses different identity stages of imposed, innate, and cognizant sexuality, Tarjou's mythological guise is fully developed, and he is highly aware of how to apply his aesthetically carnal aura in front of his onlooker. What the, quote, solitary traveler, unquote, sees in Tajou is a mirage, as in truth the child's appearance is deceitful. Despite Aschenbach's lovesick projections on the young boy, he truly is the ephemeral embodiment, or rather the treacherously chosen facade, of a very old Greek god, Dionysus. The master of debauchery, excessiveness, and immoralities is everything his contrasting deity, Apollo, is not. The god with, the god with fiery cheeks, unquote, stands for order, chastity, and pertinacity, which encompasses both Mann's and Aschenbach's ideal of the bourgeois in contrast to the archetype of the susceptible artist. It was Nietzsche's ardent belief that the Dionysian must never be separated from the Apollonian, that there must be an equilibrium between both ambivalent forces, and if one is neglected, the other will retaliate. Tajou, the Apollonian concealment of Dionysus, seeks retaliation and craves the, quote, resisting dreamer's, unquote, death, but not without toying with him first. Aschenbach, the, quote, lovesick traveler, unquote, who only had a very short Sturm und Drang phase in his youth, succumbed to asceticism and tried to combine in himself the artist and the bourgeois, which is a recurrent theme of tension and conflict in Mann's early works, such as Buddenbrooks, Tristan, and Tonio Kröger. The, quote, aging observer, unquote, who endured his life in a Saint Sebastian manner rather than savor it, feels inclined to voyage into the emblematic South, where he will find his downfall amidst the Venetian frontages. Aschenbach and Humbert bear marks of decay and are close to their death. Both have psychopomps in the form of Tajou and Lolita, who accelerate the process. Humbert is agonized by his sexuality, which resulted out of a trauma. He nevertheless consciously surrenders to it, physically and psychically. The absence as much as the presence of Lolita, are paradoxical catalysts of Humbert's death. Aschenbach dies because of a sexuality he always had, but never acknowledged, and in this unfulfilled form it will be the dissolution of him. In order to make his loss of something he never experienced even more unbearable, it will be paraded in front of him through Tajou's incarnation that awakens all his seemingly dormant senses and yearnings. The wound of Annabelle's bereavement scarred Humbert, made him a decadent, who never stopped longing for a dead memory. The wound does not heal because he cannot allow it. For him it is something fundamentally pure and guiltless because this infliction happened when he was a teenage boy. As a grown man, he still tries to live up to his elapsed reminiscence of their carefree relation and defensively aligns his proclivity according to this girl who had the same age and mindset. The poison is not just the, quote, nympholepsy, unquote, as Stephen Metcalfe names it, but he also contaminates Lolita with decadence and vice versa. Their demises are interdependent. Humbert is aware of this hopelessness, whereas Lolita is probably rather oblivious. At the beginning, Lyne portrays her as an energetic and turbulent girl with rough edges and childlike mannerisms that were partly Harold Pinter's and Schiff's ideas. Schiff explains that Lyne's Lolita, quote, was really going to be about a grown man's obsession with a child, not about a grown man obsession with a hot young chick, unquote. This is where Lyne's disturbing but good-natured aestheticism comes in. He shows Lolita as an impulsive child, who discovers her sexuality and her power as a lover over Humbert. Lyne illustrates her as being, quote, at once a seductress and a little girl, unquote. She is an unaware psychopomp, and she keeps Humbert's wound fresh and poisoned. A quote by Poe. But neither the angels in heaven above, nor the demons down under the sea, can never dissever my soul from the soul of the beautiful Annabel Lee, unquote. The plaguing infatuation for Annabel Lee and her early death altered Humbert beyond repair. Annabel epitomizes his youth, his first erotic aspirations, and an earthly love that nothing could extinguish. The passing of Humbert's Annabel created, quote, the poison which was in the wound, you see, and the wound wouldn't heal, unquote. He evokes recreations of Annabel and the memory of his emotional summer with her. He seeks her in girls the same age as she passed away, which already links his passion to death. In Humbert's attractions, recollection and longings, time stood still. The wound characterizes him. What came before the wound was such an enchanting experience for him that he desperately tries to hold on to it. Unlike his bond with Annabel, the love he nourishes for Lolita entails sacrifices. His adoration obliges Lolita to abolish her childhood, to grow up, rather violently, psychically, but not physically, which, of course, is a process subjected to failure and doom. Lolita cannot grasp the immensity of Humbert's absurdly dedicated love and devotion, because she is simply too young. As she is a victim of Humbert, he is a victim of the memory of Annabel, of his uncontrollable love, of himself, and ultimately of Lolita herself. A quote from Schiff. But there might have been no Lolita at all had he not first met Annabel, unquote, whose memory has kept him captive and lovesick ever since she has died. He further explains that the shock of, quote, that the shock of her death froze something in him. The child he loved was gone, but he kept looking for her long after he had left his own childhood behind, unquote. Alexandra Lavisari explains that an artist's muse can be a child. She further analyzes the nature and character of both parties and their relationship with each other. She writes that the muse is either very aware of her role as she intuitively knows the artist's needs, or she learns it under the artist's dictation, who uses her for his purposes. A quote by Nabokov. Changeons de vie, ma Carmen. Allons vivre quelque part où nous ne serons jamais séparés. Unquote. Throughout Lyne's film, the main flirtatious action is not orchestrated by hands, but by Lolita's feet. The feet are a body part that does not catch immediate attention, not just because of their location, but also because they may not be considered as a tool to charm and seduce. Lolita is often childlikely barefoot and playful with her feet. As a result, the question of whether she's aware of what she's doing and what she is expressing occurs. Lyne is very attentive to capture Lolita's ambiguity. On the one hand, she moves, talks, behaves, and dresses like a child. But on the other hand, her caressingly precipitating feet are her instrument of subtle and once in a while clumsy body contact. She thereby uses her childishness to please Humbert. However, she also provocatively uses it to visually remind him of his guilt. In most cases where this subliminal seduction takes place, Humbert's feet are clothed and covered in a civilized attire, under control, unexposed, and more importantly, static, whilst Lolita is exploring her boundaries and effects. Lavisari states that during the Romanticism movement, Jean-Jacques Rousseau's idea of an ingenuous and unspoiled child was a predominant belief, and that it would only be stained by the upcoming sins of adulthood. Furthermore, the quote, grown romantic unquote, understands the child as a godlike creature who reminds him of his loss of innocence, which he then mourns. A common romantic leitmotif is that death prevents the quote, moral degradation unquote, of a child, and that children are unearthly creatures. In contrast to this concept stands the parallel movement of pietism, which has the opposite view regarding children. Pietism sees children as befouled with the original sin and as quote, depraved and morally reprehensible creatures unquote, that need to be castigated. Although Lyne initially shows Lolita as an energetic and maybe problematic girl, she gradually deteriorates as soon as Humbert and her intensify and isolate their relationship. He hastens her aging and scars her with his own decadence so that the child is transformed into something in between, motherless and yearning for power. Humbert's love for her makes her cruel, even occasionally spiteful and sadistic, but only because his love will always involve loss, sadness, elopements, and captivity. Lolita will be depraved before her death. She is neither a romantic child nor a pietistic one. She is the petrified result of her lover's trauma. In the following images, Lyne symbolizes Lolita's ambivalent nature and Humbert's bidirectional prediction that, quote, he'll die if she touches him, unquote. Quote, I suppose I was afraid you'd kill me. And anyway, I was a big girl now, on my own, unquote. Through her bonding with Humbert, she already has outer signs of decadence, such as the ink stains on her fingers, the dried mud on her toes, and the crumbling polish on her nails. The black ink on her hand induces the image of rot and decay, which fits the demonstration of her occasionally demonic character and provocative behavior to drive Humbert into a state of paranoia, violence, powerlessness, and fear. Another foreshadowing reference of death is the mud on her feet. Once childlike and teasing, now shows signs of infidelity and hidden plans to get away from Humbert. Lyne's short-lived, subtle but crucially expressive details divulge Lolita's nature as much as Humbert's, which is disclosed since the beginning. It seems as if her body will be buried soon, her feet already tainted by mud, but simultaneously the image reminds the viewer of a child that played in the sludge. The reoccurring imagery is the misfortune of the child close to death after her contamination with decadence. In contrast to her degraded nature stands the white color in the background because Lolita is both naive and engaging. On the third picture, she has her hands folded in her lap as if she's praying, tightly pressed between her legs, dressed in Humbert's white shirt that is too big for her. Her folded hands suggest an angelic posture, but fallen because they are not held up high. They are clasped by her legs in a downwards movement, covering her female genitalia. In a metaphorical way, Humbert's white shirt, which could be relating to his expectations of her and his possessiveness, cannot be fulfilled by her. She is too small to fit into it. She can only be a child in it. On the fourth picture, her foot is placed upon Humbert's black-clothed lap, a body part of flirtation covering his body part of action. Whilst Humbert's decadence is not yet ecstatic and detectable, merely internal and locked away inside of him, she already exposes outer decadent peculiarities. Humbert's hands imply the movement here, taking off her white socks and softly touching her feet that allegorically point at his genital area. A quote by Desmarais and Boldick. For decadence, nature was the oppressor of humanity, and natural beauty only a reminder that states of perfection are subjective and fleeting. Unquote. Humbert's nature tyrannizes his humanity, or maybe his humanity attenuates his nature. The state of perfection he reached with Annabel was, quote, fleeting, quote, unquote, indeed. It was terminated by death, and now he tries to recreate this subjective state of perfection with Lolita, which will be even stronger, but also more fatal. The following quote illustrates the concept of decadent women as such. Quote, decadent woman is the antithesis of the submissive and dutiful minor character found in so many Victorian novels, but is sexually dominant and socially independent of men, whom she uses for her own personal pleasure and gain. Decadent woman is confidently sexual, even oversexed, and her sexuality is often perverse or corrupting. She is at times diseased. Unquote. Despite the fact that Lolita will never become a woman, she certainly shows signs of imitation and inspiration. She's not really submissive because she is still a child. She disobeys and misbehaves. Additionally, she awakens her sexuality with Humbert and experiments how far she can go and what powers she has. That is precisely one of many sources of conflict Humbert has with her, but it is also one of the features that he fell in love with, because it is childish. She is sexually dominant in a very perfidious manner, reflected by the fact that Humbert's allures consequently empower her to be in control. In combination with him, everything about her governs his being. She is his sexuality, and he is compliant to his urges. Due to the fact that his muse is not financially and socially independent of him, she recognizes the authority he has over her. This fact leads the girl Psychopomp back to her seemingly exclusive influential area of sex. Humbert is aware of his powerlessness towards the exertion of her sexuality, and therefore tries to tame her as much as he can outside the fornicating sphere. She has intercourse with him for a price, which perverts her sexuality and corrupts her age. Humbert, who sees and portrays himself as the vicious party, thinks of Lolita as unpolluted as long as she is with him and unsullied by womanly attributes and functions. Lavisari explains that the child's portrayal of chastity is what bewitches the artist and leaves no other way than to die young and live up to this illusion. As soon as Lolita loses her paradoxical Humbertian sexual chastity, she perishes as a teenaged girl that could not give birth to a child. As Asti Hustvedt has noted, decadence abhorred the natural and procreative female body, but they were attracted by all things feminine. Unquote. Humbert does not want Lolita to succumb to this cycle of nature, to become a woman, and to execute womanly functions. He suffocates under the illusion that with him she could always remain, quote, a nymphette, unquote, but she dies as an illusion of a womanly body or as a desperate attempt. She must die in order to keep the illusion alive for Humbert. A quote by Schiff. She was only the dead leaf echo of the nymphette from long ago. But I loved her, this Lolita, pale and polluted and big with another man's child. She could fade and wither. I didn't care. I would still go mad with tenderness at the mere sight of her face. Unquote. By using Richard von Krafft-Ebing's theory, Lavisari destroys, quote, the myth of the pure child, unquote, and the belittlement of pedophilia. Krafft-Ebing proved that 3-year-old children are already aware of their sexual impulses. Lavisari thereby asked the question whether sexual manifestations of certain muses were, quote, childlike imitations of adult behavioral patterns, unquote, of very, quote, conscious, careful experimentations with their awakening femininity, respectively with their sexual allure, unquote. As Lolita is at one point motherless and only subjected to unhealthy male attention, she forms and adapts her sexuality according to what she sees and experiences through Quilty, who, quote, broke her heart, unquote, and Humbert, who, quote, merely broke her life, unquote. For Humbert, a broken heart is more demoralizing than a broken life. In accordance with Sigmund Freud's and Krafft-Ebing's views of the child, Lavisari demands a, quote, radical correction of the evaluation of the child, unquote, and the, quote, the creation of a new girl type, unquote, that would dismantle the, quote, false pruderie of the European fin de siècle, unquote, and encourage a possible form of, quote, sexual emancipation, unquote.